Is this thing on? Looks like it. Well, hello there, and good morning. It is I, your teacher, Mr. D'Ambrose, recording this video from Largo, Florida, at my mom's condo, and I guess you guys know why I'm down here. I got word last night, which was the night of our snow day, right before I was going to bed, that my brother passed away. And I'm sure you can imagine how difficult that is for me, and even more difficult for my mom. And I'll talk to you guys about it when I get back. But right now, we have a mission. And that mission is to not have a long gap during this novel study. And I want to keep reading it to you. And I know that you read this chapter yesterday, but I know how you guys are. You read things and you don't catch everything. So that's my job. And so I'm here on the bed in the guest room with my phone leaning up against my brother's picture. See? Yes, there he is. And I have my laptop here with the Phantom Tollbooth ready to go. So it's just like a regular class. You should have the book in front of you and open to chapter 10, and I'm gonna read it, and I'm gonna stop, and I'm gonna talk about all the things that are important for you to know from this chapter. And I hope that you took notes on the chapter yesterday. But the notes for this chapter are already up on the website. Spoiler. So please, please, please go to my website, download the notes, and study them. I have not decided what's going to happen next week. I don't know when I'm coming back. But I hope to not be out the whole week. So if I do come back, we'll just push all the tests and everything to the end of the week before spring break. So I'm sure you'll be happy with that. But it doesn't mean don't study. You should be studying this novel. All right, let's do this. Everybody's settled. Miss Kanya can stop and pause at any point to elaborate on something. Elaborate means to go into more detail. And yeah, I guess that's it. I'll do my best to not talk too much and just keep reading. This is one of my favorite chapters, by the way, and I'm sure that if you read it, you enjoyed what happens. It's called A Colorful Symphony, and that is something we call an oxymoron. An oxymoron are two words put together that are opposites of each other. Perfect example, jumbo shrimp, right? Shrimp means tiny, but then you have jumbo shrimp. So a colorful symphony is an oxymoron because a symphony is an orchestra. Well, a symphony is actually a song produced by an orchestra. So an orchestra is all the people playing all the different instruments. And if I was there, I would actually show you an example of an orchestra playing one of the weirdest pieces I've ever heard. It sounds like something made by an alien. I put the link up on my website, though. It's called Music for 18 Musicians. And you'll see it there on the website. You should click it. You probably won't make it very far, but just like skip around through it and hear how incredibly weird and strange this music is and how hard it must be to play. But there's an orchestra playing it, and they're playing a symphony. But a symphony is sound, and this chapter is called A Colorful Symphony. So how can a symphony be colorful? And you kind of already know. So let's just get to reading. As they ran, tall trees closed in around them and arched gracefully toward the sky. The late afternoon sunlight leaped lightly from leaf to leaf, slid along branches and down trunks and dropped finally to the ground in warm, luminous patches. A soft glow filled the air with the kind of light that made everything look sharp and clear and close enough to reach out and touch. Alec, oh, that's Alec Bings, right? He's still with them? Ugh. Excuse me, I have to change my position here because this is uncomfortable. That's a little better. Hey, how are you? Good. Alec raced ahead, laughing and shouting, but soon encountered serious difficulties, for, while he could always see the tree behind the next one, he could never see the next one itself, and was continually crashing into it. After several minutes of wildly dashing about, they all stopped for a breath of air. And so because Alec Bings can see through things, but he can't see what's right in front of his nose, he keeps crashing into the trees that are in front of him. I think we're lost, panted the humbug, collapsing into a large berry bush. Nonsense, shouted Alec from the high branch on which he sat. Do you know where we are? Asked Milo. Certainly, he replied. We're right here on this very spot. Besides, being lost is never a matter of not knowing where you are. It's a matter of not knowing where you aren't. And I don't care at all about where I'm not. This was much too complicated for the bug to figure out, and Milo had just begun repeating it to himself when Alec said, If you don't believe me, ask the giant. And he pointed to a small house tucked neatly between two of the largest trees. Milo and Tok walked up to the door, whose brass nameplate read simply, The Giant, and knocked. Good afternoon, said the perfectly ordinary-sized man who answered the door. Are you the giant? Oh. Are you the giant? Asked Tok doubtfully. To be sure, he replied proudly. I'm the smallest giant in the world. What can I do for you? Oh, I just can't get comfortable. To be sure, he replied proudly. I'm the smallest giant in the world. What can I do for you? What did he just say? I'm the smallest giant in the world. My setup is definitely not working here. Stay. The smallest giant in the world. Are we lost? Said Milo. That's a difficult question, said the giant. Why don't you go around back and ask the midget? And he closed the door. Now I need to take a moment here to tell you that even though the author is using the word midget, he wrote it at a time when midget was acceptable to say for little people. It is no longer acceptable to say midget when referring to little people. You should refer to them as little people. Okay, moving on. They walked to the rear of the house, which looked exactly like the front, and knocked at the door, whose nameplate read, The Midget. How are you? Inquired the man, who looked exactly like the giant. Are you the midget? Asked Tok again, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Unquestionably, he answered. I'm the tallest midget in the world. May I help you? Do you think we're lost? Repeated Milo. That's a very complicated problem, he said. Why don't you go around to the side and ask the fat man? And he, too, quickly disappeared. The side of the house looked very like the front and the back, and the door flew open the very instant they knocked. How nice of you to come by, exclaimed the man, who could have been the midget's twin brother. You must be the fat man, said Tok, learning not to count too much on appearance. The thinnest one in the world, he replied brightly. But if you have any questions, I suggest you try the thin man on the other side of the house. So he's the thinnest fat man in the world. Just as they suspected, The other side of the house looked the same as the front, the back, and the side, and the door was again answered by a man who looked precisely like the other three. "What a pleasant surprise!" he cried happily. "I haven't had a visitor in as long as I can remember." "How long is that?" asked Milo. "I'm sure I don't know," he replied. "Now, pardon me, I have to answer the door." "But you just did," said Tock. "Oh, yes, I'd forgotten." "Are you the fattest thin man in the world?" asked Tock. "Do you know one that's fatter?" he asked impatiently. "I think you're all the same," said Milo emphatically. "Shh!" he cautioned, putting his finger up to his lips and drawing Milo closer. "Do you want to ruin everything? You see, to tall men, I'm a midget, and to short men, I'm a giant. To the skinny ones, I'm a fat man, and to the fat ones, I'm a thin man. That way, I can hold 4 jobs at once. As you can see, though, I'm neither tall, nor short, nor fat, nor thin. In fact, I'm quite ordinary, but there are so many ordinary men that no one asks their opinion about anything. Now, what is your question?" "Are we lost?" asked Milo once again. Said the man, scratching his head. "I haven't had such a difficult question in as long as I can remember. Would you mind repeating it? It's slipped my mind." Milo asked the question again. My, the man mumbled. "I know one thing for certain. It's much harder to tell whether you are lost than whether you were lost. For, on many occasions, where you're going is exactly where you are. On the other hand, you often find that where you've been is not at all where you should have gone. And, since it's much more difficult to find your way back from some place you've never left, I suggest you go there immediately and then decide. If you have any more questions, please ask the giant." And he slammed his door and pulled down the shade. Now, that paragraph would probably take a whole day to analyze, so we're not going to do that. But if some of you want to go back and reread that paragraph, that's a good one. "I hope you're satisfied," said Alec when they'd returned from the house, and he bounced to his feet, bent down to awaken the snoring humbug, and started off, more slowly this time, in the direction of a large clearing. So, like in a forest where there's like an open space, that's called a clearing. "Do many people live here in the forest?" asked Milo as they trotted along together. "Oh, yes, they live in a wonderful city called Reality," he announced, smashing into one of the smaller trees and sending a cascade of nuts and leaves to the ground. "It's right this way." In a few more steps, the forest opened before them, and off to the left, a magnificent metropolis appeared. A metropolis. Metropolis. I want you to look at that word. A metropolis is a city. So if you've ever heard of the metro, like in Washington, D.C., they don't call it the subway, they call it the metro. Metro is... I don't actually know what metro means. I should look that up. But Polis, polis, that refers to city. So a metropolis is a big city. Metropolis was also the name of the city where Superman is from. That's called Metropolis. But so they're in the middle of the forest. They come to a clearing, and then all of a sudden, a magnificent metropolis appears. A city in the middle of the forest. The rooftops shone like mirrors, the walls glistened with thousands of precious stones, and the broad avenues were paved in silver. "Is that it?" shouted Milo, running toward the shining streets. "Oh no, that's only illusions," said Alec. "The real city is over there." "What are illusions?" Milo asked, for it was the loveliest city he'd ever seen. So, pause here. Illusions are things that are not real, right? They're things that you see but aren't actually there. There's a joke in there somewhere, but I can't think of what it is right now. Things you see but aren't actually there. My good haircut? Nah, no. Okay, let's keep going. "Oh no, that's only illusions," said Alec. "The real city is over there." "What are illusions?" Milo asked, for it was the loveliest city he'd ever seen. "Illusions," explained Alec, "are like mirages," which is one of your spelling words. And, realizing this didn't help much, he continued, "And mirages are things that aren't really there that you can see very clearly." How can you see something that isn't there?" yawned the humbug, who wasn't fully awake yet. I messed that line up. It should be like, "How can you see something that isn't there?" yawned the humbug, who wasn't fully awake yet. "Sometimes it's much simpler than seeing things that are there," he said. "For instance, if something is there, you can only see it with your eyes open. But if it isn't there, you can see it just as well with your eyes closed. That's why imaginary things are often easier to see than real ones." "Then where's reality?" barked Tock. "Right here," cried Alec, waving his arms. "You're standing in the middle of Main Street." They looked around very carefully. Tock sniffed suspiciously. Hey, there's a word. Suspicious. At the wind, and the humbug gingerly stabbed his cane in the air, but there was nothing at all to see. Okay, so right there, two sentences containing two spelling words. He sniffed suspiciously. It's when you think something's going on or somebody's guilty of something. And gingerly. The humbug stabs his cane gingerly in the air, which means carefully. Like he's like, "Wait, there's a street here? What's going on?" "It's really a very pleasant city," said Alec as he strolled down the street, pointing out several of the sights which didn't seem to be there, and tipping his cap to the passers-by. So, try to imagine they're walking through this clearing. There's nothing there, and Alec is acting as if there is something there. He's like looking at buildings and he's waving to people, and there's nothing. Oh wait, there actually are people. There were great crowds of people rushing along with their heads down, and they all appeared to know exactly where they were going as they darted down and around the non-existent streets and in and out of the missing buildings. So, you've got one city called Illusions that's off in the distance, and it's beautiful, but you can't get there because it's not really there. And then you've got another city called Reality, which you should know by now is things that are real, that's reality, but it's not there. But all the people in the city are there, and they're walking in and out and down the streets as if the city's there. So what's going on? Alec explains on the next page. "I don't see any city," said Milo very softly. "Neither do they," Alec remarked sadly. "But it hardly matters, for they don't miss it at all." "It must be very difficult to live in a city you can't see," Milo insisted, jumping aside as a line of cars and trucks went by. "Not at all, once you get used to it," said Alec. "But let me tell you how it happened." And, as they strolled along the bustling and busy avenue, he began. Now pay attention, because you're going to have to explain to me on the test the difference. I should be looking at this, right? Because then it looks like I'm looking at you instead of looking down at myself. You're going to have to explain the difference between the city of Reality and Illusions. So you already know that Illusions is a city that looks beautiful from a distance but isn't really there. And now let's find out what happened to this city of Reality, because there is a connection to your city and your life. "Many years ago, on this very spot, There was a beautiful city of fine houses and inviting spaces, and no one who lived here was ever in a hurry. The streets were full of wonderful things to see, and the people would often stop to look at them. Didn't they have any place to go? Asked Milo. To be sure, continued Alec, but, as you know, the most important reason for going from one place to another is to see what's in between. And they took great pleasure in doing that. Sometimes when you're traveling, we call that the scenic route. You don't necessarily want to get there fast. Sometimes you want to take your time and take the long way so that you can see all the sights. And that's what the people in this city like to do. Then, one day, someone discovered that if you walked as fast as possible and looked at nothing but your shoes, you would arrive at your destination much more quickly. Soon, everyone was doing it. They all rushed down the avenues and hurried along the boulevards, seeing nothing of the wonders and beauties of their city as they went. Milo remembered the many times he'd done the very same thing. And, as hard as he tried, there were even things on his own street that he couldn't remember. Now pause here, because this is a very common thing with people. For example, I take the same route to work every day. And sometimes I notice things that have been there every single day for years that I never noticed before because I'm not paying attention. And in a city, this is especially true because everybody's just, I gotta get here, I gotta get to the train station, I gotta catch the subway, right? I'm in my car, I gotta get where I'm going, and nobody actually pays attention to what's going on around them. Everybody's sort of stuck in their own little world. And so the lesson here is that when you're going from one place to another, get your face out of the phone and pay attention to the world around you and what's going on. Because that's exactly what Milo did, or didn't do, when he walked home from school at the beginning of the story. He walked down with his head dejectedly and paid attention to nothing that was going on. So let's find out what happened to the people in the city of reality who... This is really getting on my nerves. The people in the city of reality, instead of taking their time and enjoying the sights around them when they went from one place to another, they started looking down and getting places faster and faster. No one paid any attention to how things looked, and as they moved faster and faster, everything grew uglier and dirtier. And as everything grew uglier and dirtier, they moved faster and faster, and at last a very strange thing began to happen. Because nobody cared, the city slowly began to disappear. Day by day, the buildings grew fainter and fainter, and the streets faded away, until at last it was entirely invisible. There was nothing to see at all. So, of course, this doesn't happen in the real world. Just because you don't look at something doesn't mean that it just disappears. But in a way, it kind of does, because you're not noticing what's happening. And in the book, of course, this literally happened. Because the people weren't paying attention to the beauty of their city, it became ugly, and then it disappeared altogether, and they didn't even notice. What did they do? I can't even get my voices right tonight, boys and girls. I'm sorry. It's been a very long, exhausting day. What did they do? The humbug inquired, suddenly taking an interest in things. Nothing at all, continued Alec. They went right on living there, just as they'd always done, in the houses they could no longer see, and on the streets which had vanished, because nobody had noticed a thing. And that's the way they have lived to this very day. Hasn't anyone told them? Asked Milo. "It doesn't do any good," Alec replied, "for they can never see what they're in too much of a hurry to look for." "Why don't they live in illusions?" suggested the humbug. "It's much prettier." "Many of them do," he answered, walking in the direction of the forest once again. "But it's just as bad to live in a place where what you do see isn't there, as it is to live in one where what you don't see is." Think about that one for a second. Maybe reread that line. It's just as bad to live in a place where what you do see isn't really there, as it is to live in a place where what you don't see really is there. Perhaps someday you can have one city that's as easy to see as illusions and as hard to forget as reality, Milo remarked. "That will happen only when you bring back rhyme and reason," said Alec, smiling, for he had seen right through Milo's plans. Get it? He saw right through Milo's plans because he can see through things? Yes, okay, you know. Let's go. "Now, let's hurry or we'll miss the evening concert." It keeps doing this. I'm laying on a bed. Stay. We'll miss the evening concert. They followed him quickly up a flight of steps which couldn't be seen and through a door which didn't exist. In a moment they had left reality, which is sometimes a hard thing to tell, and stood in a completely different part of the forest. The sun was dropping slowly from sight, and stripes of purple and orange and crimson and gold piled themselves on top of the distant hills. Anybody remember what crimson means? Or what color that is? It's red. Like a really rich blood red. Crimson. Kind of like the shirt I'm wearing, but you can't really see it in this light. Anyway. The sun was dropping slowly from sight, and stripes of purple and orange and crimson and gold piled themselves on top of the distant hills. The last shafts of light waited patiently for a flight of wrens to find their way home, and a group of anxious stars had already taken their places. "Here we are!" cried Alec, and with a sweep of his arm he pointed toward an enormous symphony orchestra. "Isn't it a grand sight?" There were at least 1,000 musicians ranged in a great arc before them. To the left and right were the violins and cellos, whose bows moved in great waves, and behind them in numberless profusion the piccolos, flutes, clarinets, oboes, bassoons, horns, trumpets, trombones, and tubas were all playing at once. At the very rear, so far away that they could hardly be seen, were the percussion instruments. That's like the things you bang, drums, bells, percussion. Percussion instruments. And lastly, in a long line up one side of a steep slope, were the solemn bass fiddles. And bass is, you hear it in songs, but you don't really notice it. Bass is that doom, 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 doom. Doom, doom. Bass is very deep and low, but it puts the rhythm into your body. All right. So, go back to the paragraph about the sun was dropping slowly from sight, and I want you to remember what I said about how the author describes settings. The author describes settings as if they have personalities, as if they can do things. Like, listen to this. The last shafts of light waited patiently for a flight of wrens, that's birds, to find their way home. So how can light wait patiently? And a group of anxious stars. What was it? And a group of... Come on. Yeah, and a group of anxious stars had already taken their place. Anxious stars taking their place. Stars are not usually anxious, but it's kind of cool when an author describes a setting by giving things personality. There's a word for that in English. It's called personification. It's when you take something that's not alive and you make it seem like a person. Like if you were talking to your cell phone like it was a person. Oh, my cell phone's really getting on my nerves, or my cell phone won't shut up. You're talking about it like it's a person, but it's really not. That's called personification. And every chapter, when the author describes a setting in this story, they use personification. And there was another author that did that. Nancy Etchkemendy from The Power of Un also did that. So that's a little tip, something you can do in your own writing. I'm going to take a pause stretch break. Look in the hole so that you have eye contact, Mr. D. I'm going to take a short break, stretch my legs, and I suggest you guys stand up and do the same. Get yourselves back together, and then press play again. We're going to finish this chapter, because this is the best part of the chapter. So the last part with the same guy in the house, that's just another exploration of something we already talked about, point of view, and about how everything looks different from different people's points of view, right? If you're thin and somebody's heavier than you, they look heavy, but then there are people that are heavier than them and they look thin to them, and so on and so forth. Everything is a matter of perspective. Okay, so far so good. Let's pause. Give yourselves a stretch. Okay, we're back. So, for you, the break was probably like 30 seconds. For me, it was 30 minutes. We left off with this giant orchestra in the middle of the clearing in the forest, and we're going to look at the podium, which I think is one of your spelling words. You know, the podium that you stand at to speak. And on the podium is the conductor. Conductor sounds like ER, but it's actually OR, and it's a spelling word, so make sure that you remember that conductor is OR. And the conductor is the person who conducts the orchestra through the movements of their hands and sometimes even their bodies. They remind the instruments. They're like a guide for the instruments to play at the right times and to move in the right ways. And so when the conductor points to this side, that side knows it's their part. And so the orchestra follows the notes in front of them, but they also follow the conductor, who conducts the movement of the symphony song. On a high podium in front stood the conductor, a tall, gaunt man, which gaunt means very, very thin, with dark, deep-set eyes and a thin mouth placed carelessly between his long, pointed nose and his long, pointed chin. He used no baton, but conducted with large, sweeping movements, which seemed to start at his toes and work slowly up through his body and along his slender arms and end finally at the tips of his graceful fingers. "I don't hear any music," said Milo. "That's right," said Alec. "You don't listen to this concert, you watch it. Now, pay attention." As the conductor waved his arms, he molded the air like handfuls of soft clay, and the musicians carefully followed his every direction. "What are they playing?" asked Tock, looking up inquisitively at Alec. Inquisitively means curiously. "The sunset, of course. They play it every evening, about this time." "They do?" said Milo quizzically. "Naturally," answered Alec, "and they also play morning, noon, and night, when, of course, it's morning, noon, or night. Why, there wouldn't be any color in the world unless they played it. Each instrument plays a different one," he explained, "and, depending, of course, on what season it is and how the weather's to be, the conductor chooses his score and directs the day. But watch, the sun has almost set, and in a moment you can ask Chroma himself." Okay, that's an important paragraph, because you need to understand that what the conductor and the symphony do is they don't make music, they make color. And they make the color of the day. And the conductor's name is Chroma, which is a word that means color. It's actually a Greek root. Chroma means color. So when you see the word chromatic, it means related to color. Chroma. Next page. The last colors slowly faded from the western sky, and, as they did, one by one the instruments stopped, until only the bass fiddles, in their somber, slow movement, doom, 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 were left to play the night, and a single set of silver bells brightened the constellations. Now, constellations are those shapes made of stars. So when the music dies down, the sun has set, and the bass fiddles are playing just those low, deep notes. Nighttime, doom, doom, doom. And then there's these little tinkle bells, and when the bells tinkle, the stars start to come out. "That was a very beautiful sunset," said Milo, walking to the podium. "It should be," was the reply. "We've been practicing since the world began." And, reaching down, the speaker picked Milo off the ground and set him on the music stand. "I am Chroma the Great," he continued, gesturing broadly with his hands, "conductor of color, maestro of pigment, and director of the entire spectrum." Now look at those three words: color, pigment, and spectrum. So pigment is just another word for color, and spectrum refers to all the colors in order. Spectrum. And maestro, by the way, M-I-M-A-E-S-T-R-O, maestro, that means master. "Do you play all day long?" asked Milo when he had introduced himself. "Ah, yes, all day, every day," he sang out, and then pirouetted, which means spinned, gracefully around the platform. "I rest only at night, and even then they play on." "What would happen if you stopped?" asked Milo, who didn't quite believe that color happened that way. "See for yourself," roared Chroma, and he raised both hands high over his head. Immediately the instruments that were playing stopped, and at once all color vanished. The world looked like an enormous coloring book that had never been used. Everything appeared in simple black outlines, and it looked as if someone with a set of paints the size of a house and a brush as wide could stay happily occupied for years. Then Chroma lowered his arms, the instruments began again, and the color returned. "You see what a dull place the world would be without color," he said, bowing until his chin almost touched the ground. "But what pleasure to lead my violins in a serenade of spring green, or hear my trumpets blare out the blue sea, and then watch the oboes
tinted all in warm yellow sunshine. And rainbows are best of all, and blazing neon signs, and taxicabs with stripes, and the soft, muted tones of a foggy day. We play them all.
As Chroma spoke, Milo sat with his eyes open wide, and Alec, Tock, and the humbug looked on in wonder.
Now, I really must get some sleep, Chroma yawned. We've had lightning, fireworks, and parades for the last few nights, and I've had to be up to conduct them. But tonight is sure to be quiet.
Then, putting his large hand on Milo's shoulder, he said,
Be a good fellow and watch my orchestra till morning, will you? And be sure to wake me at 5:23 for the sunrise. Good night, good night, good night.
With that, he leaped lightly from the podium and, in 3 long steps, vanished into the forest.
That's a good idea,
said Tock, making himself comfortable in the grass as the bug grumbled himself quickly to sleep, and Alec stretched out in mid-air. And Milo, full of thoughts and questions, curled up on the pages of tomorrow's music and eagerly awaited the dawn. So, I should also probably get to sleep because it is 1:12 in the morning, which means that you're going to be watching this like in about 6 hours or more. But we're actually going to read the next chapter because the next chapter continues this part, and so we're going to stop just a few pages in. So let's go. Chapter 11, Discord and Din. We'll talk about them later. One by one, the hours passed, and at exactly 5:22, by Tock's very accurate clock, Milo carefully opened one eye, and, in a moment, the other. Everything was still purple, dark blue, and black, yet scarcely a minute remained to the long, quiet night. He stretched lazily, rubbed his eyelids, scratched his head, and shivered once as a greeting to the early morning mist. "I must wake Chroma for the sunrise," he said softly. Then he suddenly wondered what it would be like to lead the orchestra and to color the whole world himself. The idea whirled through his thoughts until he quickly decided that, since it couldn't be very difficult, and since they probably all knew what to do by themselves anyway, and since it did seem a shame to wake anyone so early, and since it might be his only chance to try, and since the musicians were already poised and ready, he would, but just for a little while. And so, as everyone slept peacefully on, Milo stood on tiptoes, raised his arms slowly in front of him, and made the slightest movement possible with the index finger of his right hand. That's my left hand. It was now 5:23 a.m. As if understanding his signal perfectly, a single piccolo played a single note, and off in the east, a solitary, which means single, shaft of cool lemon light flicked across the sky. Milo smiled happily, and then cautiously crooked his finger again. This time, 2 more piccolos and a flute joined in, and 3 more rays of light danced lightly into view. Then, with both hands, he made a great circular sweep in the air and watched with delight as all the musicians began to play at once. The cellos made the hills glow red, and the leaves and grass were tipped with a soft pale green as the violins began their song. Only the bass fiddles rested as the entire orchestra washed the forest in color. Milo was overjoyed because they were all playing for him in just the way they should. Won't Chroma be surprised, he thought, signaling the musicians to stop. I'll wake him now. But instead of stopping, they continued to play even louder than before until each color became more brilliant than he thought possible. Milo shielded his eyes with one hand and waved the other desperately, but the colors continued to grow brighter and brighter and brighter until an even more curious thing began to happen. As Milo frantically conducted, the sky changed slowly from blue to tan and then to a rich magenta red. Magenta is like a bright purple. Flurries of light green snow began to fall, and the leaves on the trees and bushes turned a vivid orange. All the flowers suddenly appeared black, and gray rocks became a lovely soft chartreuse. I forget what color chartreuse is. And even peacefully sleeping Tok changed from brown to a magnificent ultramarine. Now, marine means ocean, and so ultramarine is a bright ocean blue. Nothing was the color it should have been, and yet the more he tried to straighten things out, the worse they became. I wish I hadn't started, he thought unhappily as a pale blue blackbird flew by. There doesn't seem to be any way to stop them. He tried very hard to do everything just the way Chroma had done, but nothing worked. The musicians played on, faster and faster, and the purple sun raced quickly across the sky. In less than a minute it had set once more in the west, and then, without any pause, risen again in the east. The sky was now quite yellow, and the grass a charming shade of lavender. 7 times the sun rose, and almost as quickly disappeared as the colors kept changing. In just a few minutes, a whole week had gone by. At last, the exhausted Milo, afraid to call for help, and on the verge of tears, dropped his hands to his sides. The orchestra stopped. The colors disappeared, and once again, it was night. The time was 5:27 a.m. Wake up, everybody! Time for the sunrise! He shouted with relief and quickly jumped from the music stand. What a marvelous rest, said Chroma, striding to the podium. I feel as though I'd slept for a week. My, I see we're a little late this morning. I'll have to cut my lunch hour short by 4 minutes. He tapped for attention, and this time the dawn proceeded perfectly. You did a fine job, he said, patting Milo on the head. Someday I'll let you conduct the orchestra yourself. Tok wagged his tail proudly, but Milo didn't say a word, and to this day no one knows of the lost week but the few people who happened to be awake at 5:23 on that very strange morning. We better be getting along, said Tok, whose alarm had begun to ring again, for there's still a long way to go. We'll stop there, and I hope you enjoyed it. There really wasn't much to stop and talk about, but I hope you did pay attention to the things I did stop and talk about. I once again, for the 1000th time, remind you that the notes are up on the website. Please study them. I'm going to try and be back by Tuesday or Wednesday. No promises. But we're going to review all the science. We're going to review all the Phantom Tollbooth. And I would like you to have your science homework done and ready. That's Chapter 5, Lesson 1. And I know there are a couple other things that I'm forgetting to tell you right now. So I'm going to press stop, and when I remember them, actually I'm just going to press pause this time, because the first time I pressed stop and I had to create a second video. So I'm going to pause this until I remember what those last couple things I need to tell you are. Stay tuned. And we're back. No, I remembered. So this reading took somewhere around 50 minutes, and so you should have a good 40 minutes left of class. And during that time, what I would like you to do is, Miss Kanya, go onto my website, to the main page, and there are a bunch of links down there to Chapter 10 bonus links. And all those links are related to science. And this really cool thing that you guys are going to love to see. There's a rare brain condition that people are born with. I think they're born with it. It's called synesthesia. And I can't even spell it right now, so you'll just see it. Synesthesia is this crazy brain condition, and I know we haven't learned the brain yet in science, but things get crisscrossed, and people can actually hear colors, or they can see sounds. They can even taste words. I know that sounds crazy, and that's why I want you to watch these videos, because this is a real thing, a real condition that some people have. So the links are there, and you can just go through them until time runs out. There's also the music for 18 musicians that you can scan through if there's time. And one final thing I'm going to put up there is a link to a playlist. It's this guy named Ken Nordine, and the album is called Colors. He's a poet who he had to do radio ads for paints, for a paint company. And the paint company said, "You're a poet, we want you to write these weird poems about colors. Give colors personality." And in the beginning, I talked about personification, about giving something that's not alive a personality as if it was alive. And that's what Ken Nordine does with colors. So he has all these different colors, and each one, he does like a little poem with music about its personality. It's really, really cool. So as long as the class is behaving, you can watch some of the synesthesia videos, check out some of Music for 18 Musicians, and listen to, like take volunteers to raise their hand and pick a color to listen to and see what I mean. And give me your feedback on Monday. So over the weekend, I'm going to figure out how to adjust the lesson plans. And so if anybody is interested, they can check my website, let's say Sunday, and there should be an updated when everything's going to be due and all that. I miss you guys. I love you guys. I hope you're having a good day. I hope you're behaving, because considering what I'm going through personally right now, the best thing I could possibly hear is that you were angels while I was gone. And those of you that were not will be defenestrated. Okay, peace out. One love. Email me if you have any questions. Bye.